My wife's family is not like my family. Her family was Catholic in the we're Italian Americans and therefore we're culturally Catholic kind of way, not in the we go to the traditional Latin Mass Catholic kind of way that my family was. But my wife grew up wearing a St. Padre Pio medal, something that I didn't even do, despite her lack of a real Catholic upbringing. St. Padre Pio is something more than someone like a St. Kevin. Apparently, a poll in 2006 by Catholic magazine Familia Cristiana found that more Italian Americans prayed to St. Padre Pio than to any other icon, including the Blessed Virgin Mary or Jesus. St. Padre Pio's cult of personality captured Italy for decades, and to some extent, a more limited extent these days, that cult of personality is still present. Is there any truth to the stories of St. Padre Pio's life? Well, let's talk about it. In today's video, I am going to be looking at 3 of the more commonly made supernatural claims about the life of St. Padre Pio. Claim number 1, the Stigmata. For those of you who don't know what the Stigmata are, the Stigmata are supernatural wounds that many Catholic saints and mystics have had over the years, which mirror the wounds that Jesus received on the cross. The Stigmata almost always include wounds in the palms of the hands here, almost always on the feet as well, and then normally on the side, right here, for the spear wound. The first recorded case of the Stigmata comes from Saint Francis of Assisi, an Italian born in the late 12th century. And the life of St. Francis of Assisi is a topic for another video, but perhaps the most well-known case of the Stigmata is from St. Padre Pio. Padre Pio is said to have received the Stigmata when he was very young. When Padre Pio was still a new priest around the age of 25, he wrote in a letter that he was feeling the pain of the Stigmata already before he actually had any visible, physical holes in his hands or anything like that. But by the time he was 28, he had physical Stigmata, and by the time that he was 30, it was public knowledge that Padre Pio had the Stigmata. There were photos that were circulating of him with holes in his hands, and people were visiting him because of the Stigmata. There are a good number of reasons to think that nothing supernatural is happening in the event of Padre Pio's Stigmata, and in this video we will cover a few of those reasons. First, there's the placement of the nail wounds. As seen in these pictures, Padre Pio's Stigmata are clearly placed in the palm of the hand, like this. And what's the problem with that? Well, the historical Jesus probably wouldn't have been nailed through the palm like that. According to this Forbes article, when nails were involved, they were long and square, about 15 centimeters long and 1 centimeter thick, and they were driven into the victim's wrists or forearms to fix him to the crossbar. In the 1930s, a French doctor named Dr. Pierre Barbet did experiments on dead bodies, and that led him to conclude that crucifixion victims would not have been nailed through the palms, but through the wrist, because nailing somebody through the palms is just simply insufficient to actually hold somebody up on a cross. Funnily enough, Dr. Barbet considered his work to be something that vindicated the Shroud of Turin, which shows the nail wounds in the wrist instead of the palm. Now, I should say that some historians and scientists think that nailing the palms could have still been possible. The argument would go something like this: yes, nailing somebody through the palm is not sufficient to fasten them to a cross, but that wasn't the purpose of nailing somebody through the palm. They would have been nailed through the feet, also probably tied around the shins, tied around the forearms, and what's really holding them to the cross is not the nails but the rope. and then the nails through the hand is just to inflict more pain. Sometimes I've even seen historians say that nailing somebody through the palm would ensure that even if somehow they survived the crucifixion, they would never be able to use their hands again, because you're just destroying, like, all the bones in your hand and stuff like that. And it's just very painful. So the Romans wanted to inflict maximum pain, make an example out of you, so they would destroy your hands, even if it wasn't holding you up. So yeah, maybe. We don't seem to have archaeological evidence of palm nails. We do seem to have archaeological evidence of wrist and forearm nails. But yeah, maybe. But it still appears like Padre Pio's stigmata and the Shroud of Turin can't both be right. But this appears to be something that a lot of Catholics have already made their peace with. In this Reddit post from the subreddit r Catholicism from 3 years ago, the Catholics in this thread are admitting that the stigmata are not supposed to convey any kind of historical information about the historical Jesus or about historical crucifixions. So looking at the stigmata as something that should be relaying accurate historical information is just kind of like a fool's errand. Like, you're not, that's just not what it's there for. So instead of focusing too much on that aspect of the stigmata, let's approach this from some other angles. The Vatican actually did some real intense research on Padre Pio when Padre Pio was first kind of rising to fame in the early 20th century. In a work called Padre Pio Under Investigation, The Secret Vatican Files, published in 2008, the original Vatican reports from the 1920s were published publicly, making this the first time that these specific Vatican reports were made available to the public since they were written. The vast majority of the research that I put into this video essay comes from that book, Padre Pio Under Investigation. That book starts with thoughts from the author, Francesco Castelli, who appears to be a devout Catholic, but everything after a brief foreword from the author of this book comes from actual translations of the actual Vatican investigation documents. That is where I will be focusing the rest of this video, since I generally like to be as close to the original sources as I can when I'm doing research. In this 1922 report, starting on page 81, the Vatican examiner, the Bishop of Volterra, Bishop Raffaello, reports that Padre Pio himself admitted that the stigmata would appear and disappear. He says, Padre Pio assures that the stigmata, quote, at times are more noticeable, at times less so. Sometimes they look like they are about to disappear, but they don't. They come back, flourishing again. The report from 1922 also makes the note that Padre Pio had acid, carbolic acid, in his room, and seems to be highly suspicious of Padre Pio in general. On page 116, it's written, a serious legitimate suspicion arose on account of the deposition that could not be discounted. One day, Padre Pio asked a pharmacist in Foggia for a bottle of pure carbolic acid. Another day, for 4 grams of Veratridine. In fact, the bishop refers to the stigmata as propaganda to drive donations to the convent at which Padre Pio was staying. He says, after some time, the event of the stigmata occurred, and what propaganda then? Not only by Father Paolino, by the way, is the superior of the convent, who the bishop actually suspected of. Father Paolino was taking advantage of Padre Pio's simplicity and trying to drive donations to the convent. So what propaganda then, not only by Father Paolino, but other religious as well, by a certain Father Raphael, a religious who enlisted as an officer, by a certain Father Placido, another religious, as far as I can remember, who was far from spiritual. So you can see here that the bishop suspects that that all of these people are kind of engaged in propaganda. That's interesting. Pages 204 to 205 contain an interview in which Padre Pio is asked himself about the carbolic acid. On page 204, they ask whether he has ever used carbolic acid on himself, either diluted and pure. Padre Pio says no, except when the doctor used it to sterilize when he would give me an injection. The same investigator asks Padre Pio about the Veratridine, question whether in the past he requested Veratridine and to what purpose. And Father Pio says, yes, I remember it quite well. I requested it without even knowing its effects, because Father Ignazio, the convent secretary, once gave me a small quantity of such powder to mix it in tobacco. So I wanted it mainly to use during recreation, so I could offer the brothers some tobacco, which, with a small dose of this powder, prompts immediate sneezing. So Father Pio here is saying that he only wanted this stuff to play a joke, right? Well, so at least the Veratridine was just for a joke, a prank. But those two substances weren't the only substances that were found that are a little suspicious. There was also iodine. Further, they ask, the iodine that you used, did you use it to help stop the bleeding or to disinfect? And Father Pio he responds, to stop the bleeding. Did you use it on all of the sores? Yes, and also on the feet and on my chest. I didn't even know whether it would work. I saw others use this medication when they happened to cut themselves to stop the bleeding. Question: it appears that when you requested the carbolic acid, you really requested it in secret from your brothers too, to administer injections to students. And Father Pio says, I'll repeat what I have already testified, that the secret was requested to conceal from those who would transport it that there was a dangerous medicine. It didn't concern my brothers. The purpose, yes, was to disinfect a syringe for injections. But just to let you know, carbolic acid could have been used to make the wounds. In fact, soldiers in World War I would purposefully inject themselves with carbolic acid to injure themselves to get them out of going into combat, right? Because if you're injured, you can't go into combat. So these soldiers in World War I were using carbolic acid. Carbolic acid, was kind of in the mainstream knowledge because World War I had just ended. We're talking the 1920s. World War I ended in the late 1910s. So Padre Pio has carbolic acid in his room, but that's not the only thing. The Veratridine is, when it's used topically, it dulls pain, and iodine prevents infection. Worse yet, it seems at times that Padre Pio's wounds would be nothing more than superficial scabbing on the surface of the skin, not actually going through. Sometimes there were actually wounds that went all the way through his hands, but that wasn't constant. At times, it was only a surface wound. On page 215, one investigator writes, the examination goes on. All around the spot, there is something like a rose-colored blood that adheres to the skin. Blood that obviously must disappear when washed with water, as confirmed by Padre Pio. It is obvious that there is no lesion of the skin, no hole, either central or lateral. From this, it seems possible to infer that the blood is visible on the hand and that coagulates in these scabs comes out of the skin itself through exudation. So all that's happening here is that there's something irritating the skin that's causing blood to kind of surface on the hand. There's no actual hole in the hand, though. So this is very clearly only a surface wound. The investigation continues, examination of the left hand, saying that the diameter of the two wounds is slightly different. That's fine. Characteristics are identical. He says same thing on the feet, except listen to this. So once the foot is uncovered on the upper side, there is something like a rosette of about 1 inch in diameter with no trace of blood, neither recently flowed nor long ago. To clarify, let's imagine a closed wound, fully healed, over which more delicate and whiter skin has grown. Such is the sign that appears on the upper side of this right foot. So Padre Pio's stigmata on his foot was actually just kind of like maybe scar tissue or like fresh skin, like lighter colored skin that looks like it recently healed. Interesting. Padre Pio began wearing fingerless gloves later in life, which is why most pictures that you'll see of an older Padre Pio have him wearing fingerless gloves. And Padre Pio himself claims that wearing fingerless gloves was a sign of, was him trying to be pious and humble. But I suspect that he did that so that he didn't have to continue applying the caustic acid to the skin to make those wounds. And when Padre Pio got older, when he would have gotten too old to actually maintain his own stigmata, the stigmata disappeared. Why would the stigmata be around for like 50 years and then only disappear once he got old and ill? In an article written by Joe Nickel called Padre Pio Scandals of a Saint, Joe Nickel reports the following. By the time of his death in 1968, Pio's stigmata had disappeared. And when his remains were exhumed for display 40 years after his death, those hoping that his body would be found incorrupt or that it would still exhibit the stigmata were disappointed. The embalmed corpse had deteriorated sufficiently that it required a silicone mask. Of the supposedly supernatural wounds, there was not a trace. For all of these reasons, I think that the natural explanations of St. Padre Pio's stigmata are just far more plausible than any supernatural explanation. With that, let's move on to the second supernatural claim that is often made of St. Padre Pio, that Padre Pio would miraculously heal people. Claims that St. Padre Pio healed people seemed to abound even early in Padre Pio's career. Pages 141 to 143 recount 2 different miracle healings that Padre Pio worked, both of which turned out to be false. The first story is about a man who sprained his ankle and couldn't walk. He was walking past Padre Pio, and Padre Pio apparently yelled out, "Throw the cane away, throw it away, walk, you are healed." Sure enough, the man threw the cane away and he walked for the whole rest of the day. He was back with the cane the next day, though. Keep in mind that this ankle had been healing for about 2 months already, so it was likely that he was close to being fully healed, and then he just kind of re-injured it by walking on it again too soon. The second one was when Padre Pio told a crippled man to throw away your crutches, walk, you are healed. The man tried to walk as best he could, floundering, leaning right and left against the people who surrounded him, yelling that it was a miracle. That evening, though, he came back to town, and everyone was disappointed to see that the miracle that had been alleged when there wasn't even the shadow of one. In another section on page 101, a Vatican investigator says, quote, "Not even one miracle holds true." Claim number 3, bilocation. Of all the stories that I heard of St. Padre Pio, this was the one that kind of excited me the most when I was a kid. And pages 143 to 145 recount 2 bilocation stories. In the first, a woman has a high fever, and her husband was taking care of her, but whenever he left the room, she would see St. Padre Pio standing in the corner. She would call her husband, he would come, he would search the whole house, and not find Padre Pio there. This sounds more to me like she was having a vision, probably a vision that's induced by her fever, than a case of actual bilocation. Interestingly, too, when the bishop looked into it, he said, quote, "I will say that this woman's family is mentally disturbed. A brother attempted suicide, another brother is half crippled and markedly cross-eyed." Now, I don't know if having a crippled brother means that you're more likely to have hallucinations or something like that. I don't think that's the case. But I do think it's interesting that the bishop just seems to be no, I don't buy this one. Another story is that somebody in a town called Foggia saw Padre Pio when Padre Pio was known to be in San Giovanni, 26 miles away. But this turns out to be a simple misunderstanding. The person who spoke to the man in Foggia was indeed Padre Pio. Padre Pio of San Giovanni. Our Padre Pio was Padre Pio of Pietrelcina. I can't pronounce that. Not Padre Pio of San Giovanni. Upon closer inspection, these 3 claims of the supernatural parts of Padre Pio's life, the stigmata, the miracle healings, his bilocation, they're just way less impressive than the stories that you hear growing up when you grow up like I did. And I think that the natural explanations just seem far more likely than anything supernatural. Thanks, everybody. Before I let you all go, let me present some more information that I found while I was doing research that just didn't really fit into the script anywhere, but I think you'll find this interesting. And hey, if you stuck around this long, maybe you'll subscribe. Okay. The first bonus claim that I want to address is something that I actually don't buy, and that's that Padre Pio had immoral relationships with women, frequently. The Joe Nickel article that I quoted earlier actually mentions this in passing. It accuses Padre Pio of sexual misconduct. It says that a once hostile Vatican eventually became conciliatory towards him, despite evidence that suggested sexual misconduct on behalf of the adored Padre. And in Padre Pio Under Investigation, many of the interviews about Padre Pio directly asked not just Padre Pio, but all of the other brothers at the convent where they all lived about Padre Pio's character. And from all of the various interviews, there's priests, there's bishop, there's friars, they all agreed, that everybody who knew Padre Pio agreed that even though that, like, yeah, he would see women in private, it was all just spiritual direction. And maybe I'm naive, but I believe them. The same people in these interviews, some of them just kind of seem to buy Padre Pio's like whole story, like unquestioningly. But some of them seem to be pretty skeptical about the stigmata, and those people don't even accuse Padre Pio of like any kind of sexual immorality with women. To my knowledge, no women ever came forward and say that Padre Pio ever did anything improper with them. And I'll highlight one interview response in which one of Padre Pio's friar brothers said that nobody doubts that he is an angel. So I just really don't think that there's any evidence of any sexual misconduct on account of Saint Padre Pio. So I don't buy this one. I think that's like a little bit baseless in my opinion. That's just me. Under that text in that same Joe Nickel article, though, you may have seen this line. It says, Pope John the 23rd recorded in his daybook that Padre Pio has shown himself to be a straw idol. This much is true. Pope St. John the 23rd didn't appear to be a really big fan of Padre Pio. He referred to Padre Pio's public ministry as, quote, contamination that for 40 years has corroded hundreds of thousands of souls, in addition to referring to Padre Pio as a straw idol. And one last thing, too, is apparently Padre Pio plagiarized the words of Saint Gemma Galgani, who died only in 1903 when Padre Pio was 16 years old. Saint Gemma Galgani was a mystic who also had the stigmata. Interestingly, she was examined by a doctor who concluded that the stigmata were only surface level and were self-inflicted. The doctor said that Saint Gemma was hysterical. This was 1903, after all. But remember, it seems kind of funny that Padre Pio plagiarized another stigmatic saint in order to describe his own stigmata. Anyway, thanks for sticking around. If you want to fact check me on any of this, sources are linked in the description down below. And until next time.